Hi all, welcome back to Tallulah Talks, and today it's Wednesday, which means it's Serial Killer Wednesday. Today we are going to talk about the first recorded female serial killer in the UK. What I like to do as well is try and look into the psychological explanations of why these killers did what they did. For this one, there's not much to do with psychology because it was in the 1800s, and back then mental health, it just wasn't, it didn't exist, it wasn't a thing back then. But they have had some researchers look into it, into possible explanations. So let's just get started. Book of stories. Mary Ann Cotton. She was born October 31st, Halloween, well, that explains a lot, 1832 in County Durham to Michael and Margaret Robson. She did have a sister, Margaret, but unfortunately she only lived for a few months and she passed away. And she then had a brother who was born in 1835. So back in this time, it was commonplace for children to die of certain illnesses, because medicine wasn't what it is now. It's very advanced now. Back then, not at all. So aged 8, her family moved to the village of Merton, and Mary Ann was described as a regular attendee at school. She seemed to enjoy school. She was of average intelligence, but a lot of the teachers and her peers said that she was always very neat and very clean. Soon after this move, unfortunately, the children's father, so Mary Ann's father, fell 150 feet into, I think it was like a quarry, and unfortunately he passed away. And because the house was in with his job, and obviously he's dead now, Mary Ann and her brother and her mum were all on the street, unfortunately. In 1843, however, her mother remarried to a man named George Stott. And at 16, Mary Ann actually left home to become a nurse. She worked for a man named Edward Pater, and when his children were sent to a boarding school, Mary Ann then returned to her hometown to train as a dressmaker. In 1852, she married her first husband, a labourer named William Mowbray in Newcastle. After this, I'm skipping ahead a bit, in the trial, it was found that 4 or 5 of Mary Ann and William's children died very young. No deaths were registered because back then a lot was mandatory. It wasn't nothing was kept up with. It wasn't what it is now, the record keeping. However, the only birth recorded was that of her daughter Margaret Jane in 1856. Another daughter, Isabella, was born in 1858. Unfortunately, Margaret Jane died in 1860. 3 years later, they had a son who was born in 1863, but unfortunately, he died the year after from gastric problems, gastric levels or something. Her husband then died in 1865. This woman clearly either doesn't have very good luck or, something's going on. And even back then, I don't know why they didn't think this was a bit, fishy that already, 3 of her children had died. And later in the trial, they would find out that actually more than that had died. And then her husband suddenly dies as well. It's a bit fishy. So at this time, her husband and her children were covered by life insurance, and so she gained a small amount, which today would have amounted to about £3,000. Soon after her first husband's death, Mary Ann moved back to County Durham. During this time, her other daughter died of typhus fever. She returned to Sunderland and was employed at the infirmary. She sent her only surviving child, which was Isabella, to her mother so her mother could look after her while she was working, and so she didn't have to bother with that. She met her second husband at the infirmary and they married of August 1865. Unfortunately, her husband always had ill health, like even before Margaret came into the picture, but it was never a worry that he was going to die anytime soon. He just didn't keep very well. He continued to suffer from ill health and unfortunately died October 1866. The cause of death was recorded as cholera and typhoid, but again, his bosses and anyone he worked with was very surprised by this because, yes, he didn't keep very well, but there was no sign that he was going to die anytime soon. Mary Ann again collected the insurance money. The next man that she got involved with was a man named James Robinson, whose wife had died, and hired Mary Ann to be a housekeeper in November of 1866. 1 month later, unfortunately, the Robinsons' son died of gastric fever. He then turned to Mary Ann for comfort and she later became pregnant. Mary Ann, her mother became quite ill and was finding it difficult to look after her surviving daughter, Isabella. So Mary Ann then went back to live with her mother a bit to look after her. Her mother soon began to recover, however she did complain of stomach pains, and unfortunately she died aged 54 in 1867. Her stepfather then went on to marry his widowed neighbour. So I think this is what they did at the time, because at that time it wasn't commonplace to have single females. It just wasn't the norm back then. Mary Ann was then left with her daughter Isabella and brought Isabella back to live with her and her partner. Unfortunately, again, I keep repeating, her daughter then developed severe stomach pains and died, as did James's other two children. Now, this is like 8-9 children by this time, right? So I get that it was quite commonplace for children to die a lot back then, just because medicine isn't what it is now. But like that many children, come on, get it together. Mary Ann again received insurance of £5 for Isabella. I don't know what that would amount to now, but I think back then obviously it was quite a sum of money. Mary Ann and James then got married in August of 1867. Their child was born in November but became ill and died February the next year. A second child, George, was born in 1869. Now, at this point, and go James, because he started to become suspicious of Mary Ann when she kept bringing up the idea of James getting life insurance, and he just thought like this was quite odd. I mean, they hadn't even known each other that long. And he actually discovered that Mary Ann had run up a debt of £60 behind his back. Again, back then that must have been quite a lot of money. It's not equal to what it is now. That probably would be about a couple £1,000 in today's money. And she had actually also stolen £50 that she was supposed to put to the bank. So at this time, he threw Mary Ann out and gained full custody of their son, George. So at this time, Mary Ann now found herself on the streets. But her friend, I think her name was Margaret, introduced her to her brother, Frederick. And I believe Mary Ann then moved in with Frederick. The friend, Margaret, who had let Mary Ann move in, acted as a substitute mother of his children, but she died of mysterious circumstances in 1870. This woman, I swear. Mary Ann at this point consoled Frederick and soon became pregnant with her 12th child. All of her children are dead except 2. It's ridiculous. Frederick and Marianne married 17th of September 1870, and their son Robert was born in 1871. Marianne learned, so she had a past lover. She hadn't married him, hadn't killed him, funnily enough, and they had moved closer to the to an area she used to live in, and she convinced her third husband, I believe, to move closer to this lover, and they consequently had an affair. Later that year, Frederick, surprise, surprise, died of gastric fever. A parish official called Thomas Riley asked Marianne at this time to then help nurse a woman who had smallpox. This woman then, Marianne complained that her surviving son was in the way, and she then asked this this parishioner if she could take her son and leave him at a workhouse, which back then was if children didn't have any parents or guardians, they would be put to the workhouse where they would be looked after, but they would obviously have to work to live there and eat. Riley said that Marianne had to accompany her son in order to do this. However, she then told Riley that her young son was sick and that he would more than likely die just like his siblings. If that's not suspicious, I don't know what is. 5 days later, Marianne then told the parishioner that her son had died, and at this point he had already found this behaviour quite odd, and he actually got the police involved. A Dr. William Kilburn had attended one of Marianne's previous husbands, and he actually found the traces of arsenic. So go him. So at this point there was a trial. She was only charged with one death. I believe it was of her latest son. Charged with one death out of at least 15. But looking into kind of like the psychological side of this, at the time, obviously when Marianne was a child, she and her family were made homeless. One of her siblings had died, and at this time it was honestly just commonplace for children to die. So it was believed that she mainly did this for financial gain. But psychologically, it could be the trauma of obviously being thrown out in the streets when she was a little girl. There wasn't a lot of money going around at this point, which would explain the financial gain of her children and husbands dying. Not justifying that at all, just saying that this could have been her way of thinking, and she maybe saw this as like a security of sorts. But again, we'll never really know, psychologically speaking, because back then that type of thing just was not spoken about. It is thought that obviously due to the financial struggle back in this time, that was the motivation for her killing her husbands and children. And that is the story of the UK's first recorded serial killer, Marianne Cotton. If this is the kind of content you like, and on Saturdays I do a Saturday haunting hour, definitely hit that subscribe